Welcome to the Listen Up podcast, where we explore hearing loss, communication, connections, and health.
Dr. Mark Sims here. I'm the host of the Listen Up podcast, where I feature top leaders in healthcare. It's great to have you. This episode is brought to you by Listen Up Hearing Centers. I help patients to treat their hearing loss to remain independent, socially connected, and have a more vibrant life. The reason I am so passionate about hearing loss is because I lost my brother Robbie twice. I lost him first to hearing loss and then to complications from radiation to his brain tumor. And I saw how it profoundly affected his life. And because of those changes he suffered, I'm incredibly passionate about hearing loss. I am an otologist, which is the E of ENT. I take care of people with surgical and medical problems with their ear. I've treated tens of thousands of patients surgically and thousands of patients with hearing loss of a nerve of origin. I'm excited to bring you this episode. If you want to learn anything more about me, you can go to www.listenuphearing.com. I've also written a book of the same title. It's Listen Up Hearing, A Physician's Guide to Effectively Treating Your Hearing Loss. Today, I have Janssen. He is the Chief Technology Officer of Cochlear Corporation. He was born in Belgium. It's amazing. He's highly educated. He has a engineering master's degree. He was just telling me in both chip design and telecommunications. He started working at Philips Electronics in hearing and then was brought to Cochlear because of his expertise. He was initially the head of a Cochlear Technology Center in Belgium and then transferred and moved to down under to Australia to work at the main headquarters. He has now been promoted to the Chief Technology Officer, where he is responsible for business development and strategy. And I'm really excited to have him here. I know him personally. I've met him many times, and he's going to be a great guest today. Jan, welcome.
Thank you, Mark. And it's a pleasure to participate in the podcast.
Oh, thank you so much. So I'm just excited you have that great, wonderful background. That is just for everybody. It's springtime in Sydney, which is fall in the Northern Hemisphere, and it's beautiful there. It looks like a beautiful day or morning, I suspect, correct?
Morning, yes.
Yes. So yeah, tell me about your journey to Cochlear. So you obviously you graduated from school in Belgium and you ended up going into the hearing space. How did you end up there? And then how did you end up being the chief technology officer? Like, what's your origin into all of this?
Yeah. So when I graduated, actually when I was studying as an electrical electronics engineer, I wasn't all that interested in medical electronics, by the way, at the time.
Okay, fair enough.
And I started actually my career at Philips, where I actually did my master's thesis. In Belgium, typically your master's thesis actually in industry. And I worked on what was called digital audio broadcasting, which is actually the digital replacement of FM radio.
Okay.
And I started actually my career working on microchips, applying digital signal processing for consumer electronic applications. And I did that for a number of years, and it was very fulfilling job. I started as an engineer, became system engineer, project manager, and actually had nothing to do for the first kind of 7 years of my career with hearing loss. A lot with hearing because all the projects I work on were audio related.
Yeah.
One of the chips we worked on was the first chips that could carry audio over USB. And in fact, when Bill Gates for the first time at one of the Microsoft conferences demonstrated that audio could run over USB, it was developed in the lab in which I worked.
That's awesome.
But in the mid 90s, actually, Philips, who was still also a hearing aid manufacturer at the time, they were approached by a Belgian startup called Antwerp Bionic Systems that had developed a cochlear implant. And so they were looking for a bigger strategic partner. And Philips thought, okay, we're in hearing aids. Implants might be complementary to that. And they became the majority shareholder of that startup. And they were then looking for a head of R&D. Still was a small company at the time, 25 people or so. And I put up my hand for that role. And that's how I actually ended up in cochlear implants. It was a bit of a serendipity. And then after a few years, Philips decided that hearing actually was not a strategic field for them. And they decided to divest that. And Cochlear was interested to take over the cochlear implant part of that business, and that's how I became part of Cochlear in 2000. Then moved to Sydney a few years after that on a 2-year assignment. turned out to be at the right time, perhaps from a career perspective, because during that period we got a new CEO. New CEOs often like to make a change. So Chris Roberts, who was the then CEO, offered me to then become the SVP for R&D in 2005. So I convinced the rest of the family to stay a bit longer.
Yeah.
And that became a lot longer. And what's changed since then is that I'm also accountable not only for R&D, but also for quality, for regulatory affairs, and for business development, strategic ventures. So that's what I'm doing today for Cochlear.
There's a lot of different stuff, isn't it?
It is, but I think it's all connected. And of course, a lot what we do in research development does need to find its way to the market, needs to get market approval by the Food and Drug Administration in the US, for example, or by other regulators around the world. So I have a vested interest to make sure that what's being developed is also does have the right evidence to gain regulatory approval.
So that it can ultimately go to market, right?
Correct. Yes, and of course, quality is very much ingrained in what's happening during the development process, as well, of course, as what happens later through manufacturing the device and supplying it. So that's perhaps the most different part of what I do, but it's very much also enjoying that part of my role. And then the final part is the strategic ventures, which is also very, very interesting. And venturing allows us to venture out also a bit outside our niche, if you want, of program.
Yeah. So, the application in my practice is, I have parents who'll say, well, I'm going to have a cochlear implant for my child. How long will this last? Right. And I always say it's designed to last for a lifetime. And so I'm glad there's people like you making sure there's high quality so it can meet that, expectation of the parents to last for them for the rest of their life. Right. And so, one of the things I've been interested in, Jan, and you can tell me, when you design, what are the most challenging things in terms of designing the inside part, the part that goes into your body, into your ear and under your scalp? So from an engineering point of view, what are those things and why? I'm really fascinated about this side of things.
Yeah, that's a great question, Mark. And as I spent the first 7 years of my career more in consumer electronics applications, and then moved to medical devices or implantable medical devices, I thought initially, how hard can it be, right? To take a certain function, put it inside someone's body. And I thought perhaps it's twice as hard. And as I now think back of it, it's probably 10 times as hard. And
which is good that people think that, right?
Yes. Yeah. And it's not that it's rocket science either, but it just requires a lot more diligence and foresight. And in particular, as you put things inside the human body is a very hostile environment. It's like seawater, right? It's basically a saltwater environment. So we need to make sure and warm. So we need to make sure that we protect the electronics from the body. Yeah, we do that by putting the electronics in a hermetic enclosure. But then we, of course, need to get the signal from that, or the stimulation in our case, from that hermetic body in which the electronics is. We need to bring it out so we can stimulate the nerve. And so that's done through what's called the feed through. So that's always very tricky technology to make that, to make sure that hermeticity is guaranteed for a very long time. Then you need to insulate these feed throughs so that the body fluids actually don't make electrical contact with those. And then, of course, depending where the device is in the body, it also might be subject to external influences, so it's a blow to the head or a tennis ball or things like that. So it's about a hermeticity. It's then protecting if you want the wiring that goes to the device, both from the environment as the salt water, if you want, as well as from mechanical impact. And the difficulty, Mark, is I would say it's not perhaps to do that once, but it's how do you do that consistently over the life of through the manufacturing process. I think that's where the challenge is.
Right. So we all know that almost, a car will wear out, or, a lot of things that we use are almost going to wear out. And yours is the exact opposite. It can't wear out. It's got to stay from not wearing out. Right. So it's a different philosophical approach to the durability.
Yes, of course, anything that has moving parts will be more likely to wear out. But also, like the silicone, for example, that protects the implant or the wiring, on the outside of the hermetic can will be subject to a kind of aging mechanism. And so we do a lot of experimentation, acceleration in the testing to mimic that. And
Where you
so
like
the rule of
twist
thumb
it
is,
and move it, right? You put it through simulations, right?
yeah, so that's for the mechanical movements, but also for chemical aging, we
Ah,
test our implants at higher temperatures during the verification. And for every 10 degrees Celsius increase that you have, that's typically doubling of the lifetime. So if you test a device at 95 degrees instead of 35 degrees, that's like 60 degrees higher. So that gives you a fantastic acceleration factor of 32, if I'm not mistaken, or 16. So sorry, 64, excuse me. So that's one method that we can apply to try to predict the long-term behavior of polymers in particular, or like silicone in that environment.
right. So you're trying to measure its ability to age in a shorter period of time so you can test the outcome.
Exactly.
Uh,
Exactly. And
that-
of course, our implants are now, so the oldest implants that are still active have been in people's bodies for more than 30 years. And still more than 90% of these implants are still in use. So it shows that that it can work for a long time. But of course, perhaps it will change after 40 or 50 years. And our modeling that we did perhaps falls apart at some point. But I think we have a reasonable amount of confidence that our implants will really last for decades. How long exactly they will last, I think we will find out. But at least we can say 30 years, 90% survival. We already demonstrated that's feasible. And I think that's fantastic.
well, that's great. And I appreciate the work that people have done to get that from a clinical point of view. That's right. And then so the interesting thing for people who don't know much about cochlear implants, that's only the inside part. And then you're responsible and you have to design the outside part too, right?
Yes, and to some extent that's actually equally hard, because unlike say many of the consumer electronics devices that we use in our lives, um, we don't tend to use them like 16 hours a day,
Right.
and we don't necessarily want to use them in environments that are more hostile to these products. I think very few people will tell their children to stand in the surf on the beach with their mobile phone in their hand, for example, although I'm sure it's happening nowadays. But the fact that people use it day in, day out, 12, 14, 16 hours a day means that yes, we have to think about it. It's also fairly hostile external
Behind the ear.
environment. There's all kinds of other things that get on the devices. And so also there we've come a long way in developing test methods that also subject our external devices to very harsh environments while we're developing the devices to really extend that useful life of the external components as much as possible.
Yeah, I remember one of your engineers sharing with me that hot sauce made sweat very hostile,
Yes, yes.
which is kind of, you never would
And
think
it's
about that.
Yeah, and it's a combination actually of sweat and UV light, of sunlight, that can be very, very abrasive to
But the
again to
two
plastics
together.
that we use together. Yes.
Yeah, so sunlight plus sweat. Yeah. Well, and guess what? When you're out in the sun, guess what you do? You sweat, right?
Yep.
So that's pretty common. And so, in terms of that, what are the most challenging things to do to design those? Durability, obviously. What else are some of the design challenges you have to face?
So the other element, of course, with the implant is that it's a bit like with the satellite. Yeah? Like once it's launched, once it's implanted, you can't get to it anymore.
Right.
So you really have to think ahead in terms of the flexibility that you want. Um, if in the future our implants will have software in them, today's implants basically pure hardware. But if you think in the future, devices like totally implantable devices, for example, will have software in them. So it's also thinking ahead: how can we upgrade that software in a way that's robust and reliable. Cybersecurity becomes more and more of an issue. Also, regulators are starting to ask more about that. Um, and of course, our products get a lot more connected. So 20 years ago, you had an implant, you had an external device. It was connected, say, during a programming session or fitting session in the hospital to a computer. That was it. Today, our external devices are connected with mobile phones, with multiple devices. Um, Through that, they're connected with software that's connected to the cloud. So there's a lot more connectivity, which is great from a functionality perspective. Can really make a better user experience, make the follow-up easier, but it also creates a number of risks that we need to think of and that we need to manage in terms of cybersecurity, privacy, etc.
Yeah, no, yeah, it's that'll be interesting when you'll update your cochlear implant app inside of your cochlear implant, right? That's essentially what you're talking about, I assume.
Yes, and even today's like the Nucleus 7, our latest sound processor, or the Cancer 2, they communicate with Apple's devices, with Google's devices. We've pioneered. We were the first company to work with these companies to get that connectivity going. But for them, it's also not that straightforward. When they do a software upgrade, they don't necessarily think of, oh, it's been used for the
Yeah.
cochlear implant. Do we anything we've overlooked? So we need to make sure that we test their beta version and things like that. And occasionally we'll find a glitch that we then need to of course work with them to fix that as soon as possible.
Oh yeah, I didn't think about that. So they do an update. They're not thinking how is this going to impact cochlear, and so you guys have to do
Not
that,
it's
right?
Yeah, they do have devices, so they have a test bed or test lab where they do test these things, but they don't necessarily think of all the use cases. Also with the bimodal users, so people that have a cochlear implant in one ear, hearing it in the other ear, we
Right.
partner with a company called Resound. Um, that's another set of use cases that need to be taken into account during the testing. That's not always front of mind, which is understandable. It's not a
Right, right.
criticism,
No, no.
just
I mean, you guys are the experts, so you check it too to make sure that all of your users are and some of it might be found after a rollout, right? And that's just kind of the nature
indeed.
of the of
Yeah.
the of the situation. So that's fine. So yeah, I mean, you're kind of developing, and this is what you're dealing with right now. Well, I assume some of your work is what's the future? What does it look like? And so from your perspective, what do you see, happening in the next 5 years? How will the cochlear implant experience or what happens or what we do change in the next 5 years?
Yeah. So first of all, I think the question mark. I want to mention that it's a very significant part of what we do, and I think particular for people that play leadership roles, like for myself, my leadership team, it is very it's not a topic we discuss once a year. It's a topic
All the time.
we have
Yeah.
an ongoing conversation on, and I would say of the say about 500 people that we have working in research and development in Cochlear, there would be about a third that would be working on things that probably have at least 5 years away. So it's a significant part of our investment is that medium um, and long term. I do think that there's a lot that will change in the coming 10 years, and I expect that actually sometimes uh, I think that more might change in the coming 10 years than what we've seen in the last 20. And I think that's because in a number of areas, I think we are um, at the point where a lot of learning that's happened over the last 20, 30 years, plus advancing technology, actually will allow us to make significant change in how we do it. So if I go through the different aspects of, say, hearing outcomes, um, if you want ease of use of the device, and then perhaps the clinical connected care, as we call it, then perhaps
Sure.
we talk about these three. Yeah. So in terms of, I think, hearing outcomes, a few things are changing. I think will change in the future. For the last 25, 30 years, we've basically stimulated the hearing nerve electrically the same way. We've made
Right.
some uh, some changes there. We've introduced more atraumatic electrodes that also are closer to the hearing nerve than what we had. But so far, it hasn't really changed significantly. I would say the way that we use the hearing nerve that's still there when it receives a cochlear implant, the straight back cochlear implant. We've worked now for almost 2 decades on novel ways of stimulating the nerve, where we can be a lot more precise, if you want, to stimulate the nerve. And I think that in the coming 5 to 10 years, I think we'll be able to take that early research, hopefully into a more broad clinical application, um, combined with a deeper understanding about the health of that nerve. So at the moment, we don't really have a good understanding which part of the cochlea is better suited for electrical stimulation than other parts. We kind of assume there's kind of uniform what we call neural survival. I think in the future we'll be able to have a much better picture of where the of how that neural survival looks like, how homogeneous it is, or the gaps in there that we can then use to stimulate the nerve in a more precise and smarter way.
So will the cochlear implant be able to map that?
Yes, yes, that's what we expect will be possible. There's already tests today that can be used to kind of make a map of neural survival, but they're fairly tedious to do that. But in the future, we expect that will be possible. And if you take that together with then a more, if you want, differentiated way of potentially stimulating the cochlea, then I think we will be able to enhance hearing outcomes in noise, with music appreciation. And in fact, we have some early work that we've done actually in our Denver lab in the US that indicates that should be possible.
So it's if I, for a simple guy like me, so it's basically a higher resolution hearing is what you're kind of talking about, right?
Yes. So so we have 22 channels today in our implants. I think we with novel stimulation methods, I think we'll be able to make more of those 22 channels. But that then also might be then the springboard to get to a higher number of channels. But it really requires us to make sure we can use every channel more than
Singular.
in a more specific way than what we're doing today. Because today to go to 100 channels probably wouldn't make a difference.
So, the thing I've always had problems understanding on is it's electrical current, so it's a field, right? Does that make sense? And so how do you get more resolution?
Yeah, so it really comes down to how can we constrain the width of that field. That's been our philosophy behind what we call pyramidal electrodes, electrodes that sit closer to the hearing nerve.
Right.
They do constrain the field already.
Because of the distance. In other words, because the distance is shorter, you can get a better resolution. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah.
Great. So that's one step. But then I think getting that electrode placement more consistent in the future, I think they're also with better imaging, and not necessarily imaging that's done through an X-ray or a CT beam, but electrically. We have methods that will probably help to guide or inform a physician how well that electrode is placed.
So you'll map the location based on the electrical performance. Is that what I'm
correct?
Right?
So that's one of the things.
This is in 2 millimeters further than this other one because of the electrical map that we're seeing, or something of that nature. Well, that's interesting.
Yeah, that's the ambition. That's definitely the ambition that we have, and I think there's some indication that would be possible. And then if we can get mechanical proximity optimized, and then if we combine that with different ways of electrically using or constraining the width of that field that occurs when we stimulate the nerve, that will then open up new ways of stimulating. And so I think that will become a reality in the coming 5 to 10 years. But of course, this is still scientific research that will take some time. Also because we know what happens in the cochlea, but how that then is perceived by the brain and how the brain can use perhaps a more precise electrical stimulation. That's also the part that's a lot harder to predict.
I'll tell you, in my career, I've gone from having very little discussions about the brain and the role of the brain in hearing to it becoming a predominant part of my discussion. And so I always tell people, they say, well, is the cochlear implant going to work? And I say, well, it'll definitely fire and stimulate your nerve. And then we have to figure out whether or not your brain and what it can do with that signal. And that's a much harder thing to predict. So,
and that's where we also see when we run these experiments that when we change, for example, the way we stimulate the nerve, is that sometimes there's an immediate effect, but often it actually almost takes people to unlearn a bit the electrical stimulation patterns that we're used to novel patterns before we see the benefit. And that, of course, means it takes time. And so while I'm optimistic that we will see significant improvements in hearing outcomes over the coming decade, I'm also cautious. I've been 20 years in this field to realize that it doesn't always go as quickly as we would like.
Wow, the fact that it takes time and happens is awesome because it shows you how plastic the brain is and how much the brain can learn and unlearn, or the ear, however you want to talk about it, right? The whole hearing mechanism. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah. Absolutely. And because cochlear implants, of course, or kind of to some extent a miracle product or solution, but it's only a miracle product because of the brain. And the brain is perhaps the real miracle. Because the sound that's been provided is fairly crude, or the information provided to the brain is fairly crude, you could say. what the normal ear gets in 3,000 channels, we do in 22. And yet people get fantastic outcomes with a cochlear implant. So the brain, I think, we absolutely deserves a lot of credit. It's our role, of course, to mimic the input that the brain can get as close as possible to normal hearing, because it will improve outcomes, and also it will shorten that adaptation time.
The ramp
Because our
up,
goal is you get natural hearing in day one. That's our ambition, right? So that you don't
yeah.
have to go through that learning process that you have today. But that's going to take time.
Yeah, I think you'll crunch it. I don't think you'll eliminate it. Right.
Agree.
That's kind of my hunch, but I mean, and it's sometimes some of the things that are worth getting take time to learn and take time, right? You can't, not everything is instant, but I know you're competing in a
You need, and
marketplace.
yeah. And if it would be 1 month, say, to get for people to get to 80 or 90% of what their outcome will be instead of 6 months, that would be already significant.
Yeah.
To get it to 1 day, I think is probably it's going to be very hard.
Too
So
ambitious.
that's yes, yeah. So that's, I think, in terms of hearing outcomes, Mark, that the progress. I think in terms of lifestyle, in the coming, perhaps not 5 years, but 10 years, I do think that what we call totally implantable devices, so where we have more elements of the system implanted, so including the battery, including the processing, including the microphone. We are now well into our second generation research totally implantable device. We started that study a few years ago. That's giving us invaluable insights in terms of the benefit that this provides, as well as in the feasibility. Still a way to go before we get to a commercial product, but I'd say rather talk about the 10 and the 5-year time frame. But I think that's going to be a very significant, I think, step forward, because it really, it's almost going from crutches to a hip implant. Right? It's now part of you. You don't have to necessarily think about it to put your external device on. It's just going to, you have hearing from the minute you wake up till the minute you go to sleep, and you can decide to keep it on while you sleep or not, or the other parts of the day. But I think that will, I think, enable a solution that blends probably more into people's lives than what we have today. Nevertheless, of course, we've seen fantastic progress in the usability of the external component. So I think the fact that there is an external component should not deter anyone from getting a cochlear implant, but I think it will really help once we get to totally implantable solutions to get at adoption. So
Yeah, it's fascinating to me because the things that just run through my head is like, well, how do you charge it? And where's the microphone? And I know they're all different takes on all of this, and so we'll see where there are a lot of, let's say, horses in the race, and we'll see where they all end up. But I know people are working at it furiously to make it totally implantable. I think it'll be fascinating. I think the external part, to some extent, compared to the hearing, maybe I underestimate it because I don't have one, but it seems totally worth it. But it will be interesting to see.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yes. And that's also when we talk about the future, we always want to emphasize, look, hearing loss, it's a big impact, particularly with severe profound hearing. It's a big impact on people's lives. Yes, there's always future technology coming, but don't wait for that. Right? Because
Right.
every year you're going to wait, your brain is deprived from that auditory input.
Simulation.
And so that's, for as much as I'm fascinated and excited to think about novel technology, my first message when we have these conversations with potential candidates, for example, that are interested, is don't wait, because it's like with everything, there's always will be better solution in the future. But
Yeah, well, I mean, it's like if why would you go without a smartphone just because there's another version coming out? Because there's always another version coming out, right? And so, and the thing is, the
absolutely.
version might be better, but going from 0 to none or from none to 1 is huge. It's a huge
It's
difference.
huge. It's huge. Yes.
So, that's great stuff. And then what's the last you were talking about clinical
So the
delivery?
last is then I think in that, in the clinical care that happens particularly after surgery. So today that's still a fairly involved process, where people, depending on the clinic that they work with, they might go back to that clinic 4 times a year, 6 times a year, some clinics 12 times a year, some clinics keep you there for a week after surgery. Um, we think there's a lot of opportunity there to simplify and streamline that. It's also, the current practice is often based on what was done before rather than
Tradition.
on good evidence, on tradition. Yes. And I think that there more and more, I think we see clinicians actually questioning the way that things are done today and looking already for more streamlined methods to do that. But that's also where technology we expect can play a big role. As we can listen to the ear, to the hearing nerve through a device, in the future we'll be able to listen to the brain through a device, even. And that in combination with artificial intelligence will probably give clinicians a tool to really simplify and streamline that and perform that care remotely if needed. So we envisage that there may be just a few sessions, perhaps in the first year, and after that you perhaps just see your clinician where there's an issue, not necessarily every 6 months.
How about prognostication? And so what I mean by that is, prognosticating an outcome for a patient and thus being able to work on expectations. So, from my experience, the people who are consumptive in an aftercare point of view are the people whose expectations haven't been met by their preoperative expectation, right? And so when we were talking about the brain being such a big part of it, it is very difficult to predict outcome and then to give language that is meaningful to a hearing impaired person that they can actually intellectualize what you mean by that outcome becomes a challenge as well.
Yeah, it's a great question, Mark, and it is an area that has gotten and is still getting significant attention in our research team. Recently, I think it was recently published a collaboration that we had with IBM, where they used all their artificial intelligence tools on a data set with a few thousand patients that we work with a number of clinics to collect that, anonymized, obviously. And the disappointing part of that is that exercise could only explain about 20% of variability. So what this suggests is that the data that was available to the exercise was probably not the right data.
Right.
And so
what you were measuring wasn't the right thing to measure, is what you're saying, right?
Yes. So if we what that data would typically have with the audiogram, so how good is people hearing, some other medical history, and so it's become age and another factors, even some cognitive assessment as well. But it was clear that we're not feeding these algorithms, I think, with the right data yet, and we're now building on that. We've improved since then, so we're making some improvements. We might be inching up to say 25% perhaps predictive value, but we're also looking what other measures could have perhaps bigger predictive value. And one of the measures that we think has a significant value, but not easy to measure beforehand, is that health of the hearing nerve. How good is that nerve that's there? One of the tests that actually does seem to be quite useful, but not used routinely, is what's called the PB Max test, is where you try to get the maximum possible hearing understanding with headphones. And that does seem to be, that might be a proxy of how good the hearing nerve is. But it's not
a maximum measure of residual capacity, correct?
Correct. But it's not a measure that's done typically when a hearing test is done. So,
right.
Because we very much could see the benefit, as you allude to, Mark, if you as a physician or as a clinician could manage that expectation based on the individual, that would be very, very valuable.
What about personality tests? Have you done anything with personality tests? Because it seems to me some of it's psychosocial.
We don't have that widely available at the moment, but I concur with your, intuition that the way that people think about their device and the motivation that they have to use it also plays a significant role. And even simple things as how many hours a day people are using the device or getting good quality speech input into their device in the first 6 months is probably an important measure. Now, through the data logging, we are now collecting a lot of that information. And we actually have at the moment a significant project that looks at that variability in outcomes and looking really at what are the contributing factors. And so I think we will also there make significant progress in the coming 5 years.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, one of my clinical experiences will tell you, it's, the term I call it is magical thinking, right? And so I have patients, you'll sit down and you will tell them exactly what you think are reasonable expectations. And as percentage of these patients, you know what they think? They go, I know you're telling me that, but I'm going to be the guy that does way better. Right. And it's almost like you can't stop them from having that thinking. And it's interesting. If you had a test that I could test for magical thinking, it would be very helpful. I don't know if it exists, but it seems like that's more on the psychology side. But we all know that it's psychoacoustics, right? So we do know that there's an emotional, psychological component to the perception of communication or ability to communicate, right?
Yes, yes, and I think also so I think we will be able to come up with I'd say reasonably predictive models in say in the coming five five or 10 years. But the other thing I also often hear is that the if you want objective hearing outcomes that people achieve after their cochlear implant don't necessarily correlate with the happiness
Agreed,
about
a
it. So there
thousand
might be
percent. A
yes.
thousand. I mean,
So
yeah. Yeah, I have a patient that comes to mind. She was polyhandicapped and she was incredibly difficult to manage educationally. She was on, multiple medicines to curb her behavior. And then she got a cochlear implant. She has no open set. She has speech perception. She's off of all medicines and she went from having 4 care providers to 1. Now, from a hearing outcome point of view, it's terrible, right? But from a satisfaction outcome, her mother will tell me every year it's the best thing she has ever done to improve her daughter's quality of life, right? And so that's an extreme example, but I agree with you 100%. And so the hearing tests, I mean, because we've all had these people where you say, you are an amazing performer. And they go, I don't like it at all. I don't think I'm doing well. Or people who don't do well and they're like, this is all, this is great. Right. And so we both see that. It's an interesting thing. And I think obviously once you have a bigger and more robust data set, you'll be able to stratify out on these more softer things to measure, if that makes sense.
yeah. So mind there's a bit of background noise here.
That's okay. We're good.
Is that okay?
Yeah, it's fine. So that is really great stuff, Jan. I really appreciate it. And so let's talk about okay, so that's that. What about 25 years? Let's get real pie in the sky.
Yeah. So one of the things that's also happening, of course, is there's a lot of research happening towards pharmacological solutions for hearing loss, and so we do see, and that's not even will be 25 years away, but where we see a combination device or combination therapies between that will combine drugs with devices. We actually announced last year that we started a pivotal trial with the first drug-eluting electrodes, so cochlear implant with a drug-eluting electrode. Now that has a steroid that's there to help manage the foreign body reaction after implantation, but that's really only just the start we expect. So there's other research that was published in Nature, for example, a few years ago, which we were part of, where as part of the implantation procedure, this was in preclinical research or in animal research,
Right.
an animal model, where neural growth factors were applied in the cochlea just before the cochlear implantation. And that's in that animal model, it was demonstrated that that actually helped to resprout connections from the hearing nerve out into the cochlea. So on one hand, we tried to bring the electrode close to the nerve. This is bring the nerve close to the electrode. Right. And so we're now part of a human study that's in which that's been tried out here in Australia. That study is still ongoing, so it's too early to talk about the outcomes. But if what we see in the animal model is true, then as part of the cochlear implant procedure, we might not only you can provide electrical stimulation to the nerve, but also enhance the nerve. And I think it's quite likely that those type of therapies will become a reality. Perhaps not in 5 years, or probably not in 5 years, but in 10, 20 years. I think that we might be able to augment, if you want, also the biology as part of the therapy.
Yeah, that's what I love about this field because I think there's stuff from other fields that'll become applicable. So I always say to patients, thank God for cell phones. They go, why? I said, because all of this connectivity and these smaller batteries and all of this stuff that you have in your cochlear implant is a lot of it is technology developed for bigger fields that then gets moved over to cochlear implants. And so, the other work in nerve regeneration might be cochlear nerve regeneration, but other nerve regeneration will hopefully there'll be, further breakthroughs that you'll be able to roll out very quickly in the hearing world and be able to get a huge impact. That's great.
The same with the brain. There's drugs being developed to help people to augment their brain function. One application of those could be indeed for devices like cochlear implants, which might really need that could benefit from that boost in particular in the first months after receiving a cochlear implant. So it will be fascinating to see what will happen, how cochlear implants will look like in 25 years.
Yeah, so it sounds like there's plenty of stuff for you to work on in terms of expansion in the field.
The challenge for us is not the lack of ideas how to improve it. It's more how do we select between all the things we could do. How do we select the things that we think will have likely the biggest impact?
Yeah, so a little bit of a gamble, but hopefully an educated gamble.
That's I guess what my role and others in the company is about.
No, that's great. I mean, well, we need leadership in this row to figure out where the resources go and where the field goes. And I know there's a lot of stuff and a lot of great ideas, but this is great stuff. So, one of the questions I always like to ask Jan is, in terms of your mentors, who do you thank in terms of the people who helped you get here today? Like, so who do you thank? I mean, it's always nice to know who are the people that get you to where you are today.
Yeah, so it's a great question, Mark. So the people that come to mind, first of all, is Professor Stefan Peters. He was my mentor when I moved into cochlear implants in Philips. So when I moved in that small startup that Philips had acquired, he had been, he's one of the founders of that company, and he taught me a lot because I didn't know anything about cochlear.
Right.
And so he taught me a lot, and still a lot of my thinking today actually goes back to some of the philosophy. For example, in that selectivity of stimulation, there's a big focus of him at the time. So I learned a lot from him. Learned a lot then as I became part of Cochlear of people like Jim Patrick, who was Cochlear's first head of R&D and led R&D for many years. John Parker, who was my predecessor in my role, taught me a lot about reliability, about the things that how we could use things like neural telemetry, for example, response telemetry, and how that could improve the devices. And on the business side, also the CEOs that I've worked with. Chris Roberts worked for Chris as a CEO for more than a decade. Was a good mentor. I think very wise man in terms of how he approached things. Chris Smith, who was then his successor, very dynamic and challenging left, right, and center, but really good for people to push you out of your comfort zone. And now Dick Howard, who was the third CEO I've worked for. So those would be the people that I learned a lot from, but also from a lot of physicians that we work with, Mark. It's like yourself, I always enjoy having conversations with physicians and the way that they think, because you're very close to the patients, and the way that you question often what we do, but also emphasize what's really important for the patients. So
yeah, no, we're all trying to get great outcomes. It's wonderful. So one question I love to ask people, John, is what's your favorite sound? I mean, you're in the sound business, so what's your favorite sound?
Yeah, so it's not about a question. It's probably more a category than a single sound, but I would say it's music. So I love music. I actually play in the Cochlear band, so we have a band at Cochlear. I play in that. So yeah, music is something that has fascinated me, which is also why when I was started as an engineer, starting at Philips, working audio was something that I very much enjoyed, and it was probably also for me one of the reasons why I made the step into cochlear implants. Now I know that people with cochlear implants have a bit of a sometimes love-hate relationship with music. Some people really enjoy it, others say it's so different. And so definitely one of my ambitions is to make sure that we can make music also as enjoyable as possible for our cochlear implants.
Well, I'm not going to, at some point, maybe I'll try to figure out in my own head who are the members of the Cochlear band. I don't want to know, but I could put some in the band and it would be funny to make up the composition of the band, but I'll leave it at that for that. So, Jan, thank you so much for the time. This has been great. If people want to get a hold of you, where do they find you? On the website, or where do they find you?
Yeah, so people are free to contact me through my email, through LinkedIn. I'm happy for you to share my email, Mark, as part of the podcast, jjanssen@cochlear.com. But yeah, always very happy to talk to anyone about cochlear implants, what the future brings, and any questions or concerns that might.
Well, this has been great. I really appreciate the conversation. We've had Jan Janssen. He's the Chief Technology Officer of Cochlear Corporation, and I appreciate him. And it's amazing that I can talk to you from the opposite side of the world, and we can have a face-to-face conversation. Technology is just absolutely amazing. Thank you for coming on.
It's been a pleasure, Mark, and looking forward to see you in real life, hopefully next year.
Thanks for tuning in to the Listen Up podcast. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get updates on future episodes.